Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our online seminar this evening. My name's David Thomas. I was going to introduce Parminder Dhillon to do the introduction, but unfortunately she's been able to join us this evening because of technical difficulties, but she has sent me her introduction. So I'll just read that out as it is, but thank you all for coming and Croeso. I'm delighted that our speakers, writers Amrit Wilson and Bharti Dheer are with us today to speak on the theme of From Migration to Resilience. This is the Welsh Asian Heritage Project's second monthly talk. Our monthly seminars provide a platform for wider debate around equality, migration, resilience, identity, culture and heritage. Parminder is the project leader for the Welsh Asian Heritage Project at the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales. The Welsh Asian Heritage Project is a community engagement project that celebrates and archives the experiences of Ugandan Asians in Wales, especially those who came to the camp in Tonfanau, North Wales, after being expelled from Uganda in 1972. Important places of cultural, religious and historical significance to the Welsh Asian communities are also being recorded. Through the prism of Ugandan Asian stories, we are capturing the Welsh Asian heritage. The project is funded by the Anti-Racist Wales Culture, Heritage and Sport Fund, which is part of the Anti-Racist Wales programme. Before I introduce the speakers for this evening, a couple of organisational points. You're welcome to ask questions after each talk as well as at the end. Please write your questions in the Q&A function and not in the chat. We'll be using chat to post additional information for you. Tell us your name and indicate if you would like to have your camera on. We will try and put this on to make the session as interactive as we can. I think the thing to do as well is to put your hand up as well as a participant. This evening's talk is also being recorded and be shared on other platforms. For those not watching this live, you're also welcome to send us any questions and to share your comments. We will reply to them as soon as we can. And now to our talk this evening on From Migration to Resilience. And it's my great pleasure to welcome our speakers, writer Amrit Wilson and Bharti Dheer. I'll just give a quick overview of the books written by Amrit and Bharti. Amrit wrote a book, Finding a Voice, about the experiences of Asian women from the Indian subcontinent and from East Africa back in 1978, based on one-to-one interviews with women in the language in which they wanted to speak. We can say that it was the first oral history involving Asian women themselves. In 2018, the book was updated and included contributions from younger Asian women on finding a voice 40 years on. Bharti's book, Worth, is a personal memoir of her experience as a Black Ugandan heritage woman adopted by Sikh parents, and then in 1972 expelled from Uganda by Idi Amin. There is so much more to say about the books, which I hope you'll find more about from the questions you will ask. So let's start. I have great pleasure in introducing Bharti Dheer, our first speaker. So Bharti, you could turn your video on and turn and unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hi there.
Oh, I apologise. I'm getting a few technical problems now.
We can hear you, but you can't see you yet, Bharti.
Yeah, let me just see.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
Oh, can you see me now? Yes.
I can. Yeah, that's great.
Hello. Sorry. Apologies for that. Thank you very much for the introduction, David. Sorry not to see Parminder, but it's a pleasure and an honour to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
I think Parminder's. We may be able to get Parminder in halfway through. So if you carry on, we'll try and get Parminder in.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just looking. So I thought, first of all, I'd just do a little bit of introduction of myself. David's covered some of it, but my name is Bharti Dheer, and I wrote a memoir which was published in 2021. And it's about being it's a story of my life. It's called Worth because I wanted to highlight the experiences that we go through in life, and some experiences bring up our sense of worth, some experiences bring them down. It's basically a story of empowerment, And yes, within that, it's about the journey my family made from Uganda to the UK when Idi Amin threw all the Asians out. And like the experience of many refugees and many displaced people, hundreds and thousands all over the world, it was an unexpected time of our lives. It was something that we never envisaged, leaving our homes, leaving our schools, leaving our livelihoods, and just being told in that within 90 days we had to leave, or the consequences would have possibly been death for many hundreds. And unfortunately, in the process of those 90 days, there were many hundreds that died and lost their lives, not just within the Asian community, but also within the African community. So just wanted to, I thought I would start by just reading out a little chapter, a little bit, a paragraph of what we actually went through as a family on our journey out of Uganda. So this is from chapter 7 and it's called A Mother's Courage. So I'm just going to read out a short paragraph. If I find one more cent in these belongings, I promise I'll shoot you dead here and now. The soldier is staring at my brother Shankadas. Our suitcases are open on the roadside and the soldiers are rifling through my brother's things. 2 cents had fallen out of his clothes and we were praying the soldiers wouldn't find more. One of the conditions that Idi Amin had imposed when asking Asians to leave the country was that no one could have money in their possessions, regardless of the amount. The president believing Asians had exploited Ugandan people enough. They didn't need any excuse when it came to shooting people for stealing, even just cents, which were equivalent to pennies. So we'd been under strict instructions not to travel with any money at all. It was such a tiny amount, just forgotten about and left in a trouser pocket. Surely my brother wouldn't die for that. So there's, where we lived was Kabale. So I just want to set the context a bit. And that was about 300, 400 kilometers from the capital, Kampala. And I know that there are people in the audience here today who would also recollect similar journeys where we were, when we were traveling up to the capital in order to get to Entebbe, the airport, there were roadblocks set every 50 miles or so. And that's where we had stopped at the first roadblock where the soldiers were searching our luggage. So Asian families heading for Kampala from towns outside were forced out of their cars and onto the roadside while their vehicle and luggage were systematically searched. The soldiers took anything they found for themselves. Some families never even made it to Kampala, and rumors of girls being taken by soldiers, never to be seen again, were rife. Because it was a distinct possibility in some cases that girls were dressed as boys. Some had their hair cut and others had their hair tied in buns with turbans placed on their heads. Either that or they had buns knotted in a handkerchief, so they all looked like Sikh boys. Also, they wouldn't be abducted, raped and killed. So my mother contemplated doing the same thing to my sisters and me, but changed her mind, believing that if other families ahead of us had already done it and were found out, it actually might be worse for us should we be stopped. We waited in the blistering sun as the search continued. No more coins rolled out, and I was reaching the conclusion that surely they'd let us drive on now. Instead, I realized the soldier's gun was now pointing at my mother, and we were mute with fear, the deafening sound I could hear, merely my heart pulsating in terror. Leave her behind, he ordered, glancing at me briefly. She's one of us. Time stopped. Leave her here. The soldier's eyes were bloodshot and full of hate. My mother kept her gaze lowered, demonstrating her deference. Looking at him directly would have antagonized him further. But I can't leave her. She's mine. I stared ahead. From the corner of my eye, I could see his gun still pointing at her chest. I said, she's one of us. What use could you possibly have for her where you're going? The soldier's voice was now raised, and he looked as if he was about to step forwards menacingly. Still gazing down, my mum was adamant when she replied, if we leave with her. I'm not leaving her behind. Mr. M, the taxi driver who was waiting for us to get back in the car so we could continue to Kampala, shot a glance at her. I could see he was alarmed, no doubt wondering if she was mad, arguing with a man who was holding a loaded gun in his hand. He moved quickly to one side to distance himself from us, to make it clear he wasn't one of us. He evidently didn't want to be shot, and certainly not for one little girl. I said, leave her behind, the soldier repeated. Mum gave him the briefest of looks and lowered her head, and she continued to basically say no. He cocked the trigger. No one moved. It was hard to breathe. As we waited for the soldier's decision, I did recite the Lord's Prayer the missionaries had taught us. I couldn't remember all of it. Suddenly the soldier laughed. He threw his head back and actually laughed. He lowered his gun, pointing the muzzle at the ground. Then came what I took to be a grudging look of respect, or was it admiration? Okay, you can go. I salute your courage. He nodded to my mother. Take her and go, he said, with a dismissive wave of his hand towards me. I will radio ahead to tell my comrades to leave you alone. So the reason I wanted to talk about that passage was not just about my mother's courage and resilience, and the courage and resilience of many parents who went through that process, and the many, many refugees who still go through that process of just surviving and trying to save their children's lives. It meant, of course, it meant a lot to me. It meant a lot to my worth to have a mother that loved me so much that she was willing to give up her life for me, and potentially the whole family's life. Because just before we had been ordered to get out of our car, we had seen a child getting shot in front of us simply because he was disabled. And the mother in that situation was not even allowed to scream her grief or her anguish. In fact, she was forced to praise the soldiers for doing what they did in order to save the lives of the rest of her children. So we are so entitled and privileged in this country that we have never been put in a situation, we hopefully never will be put in a situation like that again, where we are forced to make decisions to save our lives and save our children's lives. We're not put in a decision where we have to make a choice of leaving a child behind. So I wanted to talk about that's the first step of resilience that comes about in refugees and people who are displaced because they are fleeing from war or from dictators or from governance that seeks to kill or torture or imprison them for whatever values those families hold or for whatever they represent. And, you know, people fleeing because of homophobia or racism or sexism, whatever you may call it, or just because it's the whim of a dictator, as it was in our case. In my memoir, I've gone on to talk about our experiences in England when we came. Initially, we went to a camp in Greenham, which was an American base. The Americans had left, I think many of you will know about Greenham because of the CND protests that were taking place in the 70s and 80s there. And we stayed in this camp for about 7-8 months before we were housed in Reading. Our experience in Reading was very positive, but there were a lot of negatives. And I want to talk a little bit about the negatives, but I will also go on to talk about the positives, because again, it demonstrates our resilience, and my mum's resilience particularly, because my mum was a widow and had five children to bring up. One of them was me, who was adopted, half African, half Asian. The rest of my family are Asian. And I think that's the context of why the soldiers were asking my mum to leave me behind, because I was half African. And as far as they were concerned, I was one of them. When we arrived in a council house, our first experience, we'd had a very positive experience in the camp. We were quite mollycoddled. In fact, even when we arrived at the airport, we were mollycoddled because the coach driver asked us to close the curtains as we were leaving Heathrow Airport. So we weren't aware. We saw crowds of people waving placards, but we weren't aware that those were National Front supporters protesting about us being there and being in this country. So we were blissfully aware. And then we went into a camp. And again, we were surrounded just by so many kind volunteers, mainly white, who took us under their wing. And, we were fed, we were clothed, we were treated with great kindness, great respect, great courtesy. So we were pretty mollycoddled. And it was only when we went into our council house in Reading that we've got the first stirrings of or realization that we were not welcome. And we started having bricks come through the window, which I've described in my memoir. We had bricks through the window, the kitchen window, the bedroom windows. We had graffiti on our walls, on our doors, asking us to get out. We didn't belong. There were racial slurs against the family, like saying things like "Packy's out." I think that's all they could remember. That's all they identified when they saw brown faces, basically. And it culminated with a threat of threats to kill us. We had a tree that was in our front garden. A branch of it was chopped down during the night and placed against the door, and it was set on fire. So even if we tried to open that door, we wouldn't have been able to get up because we would have been met by a wall of fire. And and my mother when she went shopping, she used to go through a little park to get to the bus stop, and little children as young as 4 or 5, would chase her and kick her and shout at her and racially abuse her. And I just wanted to raise those issues here because of the resilience that was shown by my mum, the courage that was shown by my mum. She was very philosophical. She used to say, "Oh, people who do this, you mustn't mind them because they are sick in the head. They've got something wrong with them mentally, and that's why they treat other human beings like this." And so I grew up just thinking, oh, the problem is not with us. The problem is with these people who are doing this because they have got a sickness in their mind. That's the exact phrase my mum used to use when you translate it from Punjabi. They've got a weakness or a sickness in their head. And that is why they hate people of different colors or different, or anybody that's different from them. But I just wanted to sort of highlight that when my mum interpreted that in that way, she didn't preach back hate. She didn't preach back revenge. She was sort of genuinely trying to show us that there needs to be compassion for people who do these sort of things. And even with the soldiers in Uganda, who we heard had committed so many atrocities, Mum used to say, they are weak, and they're weak because of the circumstances they've been put in. Maybe they don't want to do these things, but they're being compelled to do it by their, by their leaders, or particularly by Idi Amin. So when we talk about resilience and we talk about coming, being displaced or being refugees, that is just a small measure of the type of scenarios that refugees come from, and the desperation that's shown and the resilience that comes about as a result of adversity. And I'm just doing this talk almost as a tribute to the mothers and to the parents who have to make very difficult choices to save themselves and save their children's lives. And that is just literally the start of the beginning of resilience in those parties. I'm going to end my talk there now and just open up for any questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much, Bharti. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
What profound sharing of your personal experiences, very traumatic. And thank you for sharing that. But also the trauma of being expelled from Uganda and then coming to Greenham Common and thereafter being subjected to the same kind of hatred, in terms of the racism that was experienced. And your sharing of tribute to mothers is really, really profound. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for reading a section from your book. I read the book back a couple of years ago. And at the interview for this job, actually, I was asked about an archive story that I particularly liked. And of course, I said, Worth. And because it's so complex, your story is so complex and met so many different levels in terms of heritage, in terms of abandonment, in terms of, forced expulsion. And then throughout all that, there is the resilience. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
David, over to colleagues to see if there are any questions for Bharti at this stage.
Thank you.
We haven't got any questions in the Q&A, but I think Radha's joined us, and I think she might want to ask a question. Radha, do you want to ask something?
Yeah, sorry, do you know what? I haven't had I don't know how to phrase it in a particular way. I'm just gonna switch on my camera. Oh, if that works. Yeah, that was like really incredible to hear. I guess because you're talking about being a child then, and like you have such an incredible memory. I think memory is so I wanted to know, I guess, like how you managed to remember all of that, and what were the conversations like essentially growing up. I think for my own family, I know it's not really like talked about much in depth, I think just because it's quite traumatic for both my grandparents, but like my haven't really but I guess I just I wonder how did you like hold these conversations as a family as you got older?
Yeah, Radha, it's a really good comment to make, because to be completely frank, my mother never wanted to discuss it, and we never really talked about it. We never talked about our experience in Uganda unless we just wanted to reminisce about something positive. But in terms of the trauma, I think trauma goes very deep, doesn't it? And a lot of people I know have never talked about their experience of coming out of Uganda, what they witnessed, what they saw. There was a huge impact on mental health of parents. Some parents did go into depression because of what they'd lost. You know, they started probably with nothing, as many parents did in Uganda, Asian parents, and they'd built their, you know, some of them had literally started from scratch, and then to have it all taken away just very suddenly, in a matter of what would, you know, you would call days. You know, you've had your years and years of building up, and then suddenly it's snatched away from you, and everything you've ever known is snatched away from you. I think a lot of people were too traumatized to talk about it. I've been blessed with a good memory, and I've always loved writing. So I did write a diary of some sorts. I wasn't very religious with doing it daily, but I remember writing up some stuff. But some things, as I started writing my book, some pieces of memory came back to me. And I think that was the only time I started talking to my siblings. So they filled in some of the gaps. And it was the first time ever that we'd actually sat down. Sadly, my mum passed away many years ago. But when I was actually writing my book, I gave them the draft. And then they went, oh, yes, I remember that. Oh, no, I don't remember that, but I do remember this, and I remember this. And they actually helped me fill in some of the gaps. So that helped my family to talk about that journey, and to talk about Uganda, and to talk about the less positive bits. And it helped fill out my book as well, because they had little memories that they wanted to share then. So, yeah, you're very right. It's very difficult when people have come away, for people to revisit some of those experiences they've had. And I've had comments from people saying, oh, your book has really resonated with some of my family's experiences, but I still can't get my parents to talk about Uganda and leaving Uganda.
Thank you, Bharti. I think part of what we are doing in the Welsh Asian Heritage Project is actually capturing people's stories.
Yes.
And come across exactly the same kind of issues that you've mentioned. And so our theme is from expulsion to resilience, and resilience in the way people want to define them, define that for themselves and for the community. So thank you for that. I think we've got a couple of other comments and questions.
Yeah, we have. Marion says, astounding presentation. Thank you very much for sharing your stories and those of others. They were profound and unforgettable. And
Thank
then
you.
Graham has asked, has commented, he had to join late. Will the recording be made available online? Yes, it will be made available online. Once we've downloaded the video, we put some subtitles on, so it won't be available immediately, but it will be available. And then Robin asks, you speak a lot about your experience with the divine. As somebody that also grew up visiting both Gurdwaras and mandirs, I was wondering how these experiences affected your relationship with religion and belief.
Okay. So yes, in my book, I have talked about relationship with divine. For me, I would say I'm more of a spiritual person as opposed to a religious person. So although I do visit the Gurdwara, I am very much into the spirituality and the humanity of mankind or womankind. I'm very much into seeing everybody as being equal regardless of their religion. And so I do make a distinction, because some of my religious teachings that we have may actually, when I've talked about my experiences, for example, let me just give an example to be very clear. So when I've talked about contracting a skin disease, and it's called epidermolysis bullosa, EB for short. So the difference in religious teachings, I got a lot of people saying things like, oh, you must have done something bad in your past life to be suffering like this in today's life. You must have committed some sins, or this is a test. This is something that God is testing you with, testing your faith. If I hadn't prayed, if I prayed for healing, I was told, oh, your faith isn't strong enough. That's why you've not got healing. So there were all sorts of religious messages that were given to me. But from a spiritual aspect, for me, it's about accepting the person with the skin condition and accepting that this person has got this skin condition or this experience, and embracing that person regardless of what your teachings teach you about that person going through a particular ailment or a particular experience. So instead of questioning why that person's got that particular illness or is going through a particular experience and trying to put it as something to do with God and, God's treatment of you or God testing you, my view is that God is loving, the divine is loving and accepting. So don't sit there and trying to put people into a box of not enough faith or having done something bad in their past life. This is karma, whatever it is, but just accept that the person's got that condition and just love and embrace that person, which is the spirituality part. So I'm just trying to explain the difference. And that's how I see the difference. It's all about not saying this person shouldn't do this, or this person did this, or this person's like this because of sin or whatever, but just saying we accept and love the person for who they are and what they are, and not going to seek to change them just because they're a particular religion or whatever they are. So that's the big difference to me in terms of spirituality and religion. And that's why I say in my book that yes, I accept that there is a divine being, there is a divine, but I don't really like to affiliate myself with any particular religion. I affiliate myself with spirituality and humanity first and foremost.
Thank you, Bharti. We could have another session on this very topic. I know we've got a couple of questions and then comments, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. A couple of comments to start with. Firstly, from Pretty, as I remember you and your family at Greenham Common, it will be good to have a chat when you're available. So nice there. And then Lauren says, presentation is very insightful. Thank you for sharing your experience. And then lastly, there's a question from Richard who says, thanks for the inspiring talk. Can I ask, how do you feel about your identity now? Has it changed over time?
Okay. So it has changed a lot. I mean, in terms of my identity when I was younger, I was Black, I was African, Asian in heritage, and there were very few of us. So my identity was very tied up with being abandoned as a baby on a roadside in Uganda. It was very tied up with negative messages about being adopted, about being illegitimate, people saying that I had bad blood. I would dishonor my family the way my birth mother had probably dishonored her family by having an illegitimate baby. So my identity when I was younger, I would say, to be honest, was very negative. I didn't see myself as beautiful because I was seen as dark by the Asian community. I was seen as being ugly. I was half African. So there was a lot of prejudice there. And I grew up, I think, as a child and in my teens, not really seeing a positive image of myself. As my political awareness has grown and as my spiritual and emotional awareness has grown, I now am very proud of who I am. I see myself as a Black woman. I am of dual heritage. I see my culture as Asian, but I see my racial identity as being African Asian. overall, from a political perspective, I'm a Black woman, very proud of who I am now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bharti. And I'm sure there'll be more comments and questions at the end. So thank you very much. I'd like now to move on to Amrit Wilson.
Thank
Amrit,
you.
I'm sorry I wasn't here at the beginning with all my IT problems. I have known Amrit since 1970s. She was my mentor in terms of my first journalist kind of writings. And Amrit wrote her book, Finding a Voice, in 1978, based on one-to-one interviews with South Asian women from the Indian subcontinent and East Africa. What we would say it's probably one of the first kind of archives around Asian women's experiences, exploring all those layers of racism, sexism, patriarchy, and more, which Amrit will be is much more better placed than I am to talk about. The book has been updated in 2018 and includes a chapter particularly with younger Asian women talking about finding a voice 40 years on. So it's my great privilege to welcome Amrit as our second speaker. Over to you, Amrit.
Thank you so much, Paminda, and thank you, Bharti, for that amazing presentation. Well, I have to start off by confessing that I'm not from East Africa. I came here directly from India. But some of the points which Bharti raised, I've seen them. I've seen them not only in the work I've done with South Asian communities, but also the work which I do now with refugees, with other people who are going through trauma. After all, we are living at a time when a genocide is going on. And it's a genocide which we can't ignore because it's brought to us image by image into our homes. And what's interesting is that the people who are committing this genocide are those who have themselves suffered. And so in a sense, it's quite interesting to look at, the position of the East African Asian community in this country, but more on that in a minute. Firstly, I'd like to talk about the work I did. When I realized that I had to live in this country and I was not going back to India, and I realized the extent of racism, because wherever you live in Britain in those days, you're not sheltered from it. You face it. I remember having my daughter, who was young at the time, going out with her, and being threatened and feeling really scared that something would happen. And I think for us as women, we do have courage, but our courage comes out also of a terrible fear. The two go together. We cannot separate one from the other. And that fear perhaps comes out of the extent, the way we love, our children, our families, and so on. Now, when I started work as a journalist, I was one of the very few South Asian women journalists, even South Asian journalists at that time. And I used to cover stories about immigration, about conditions at work of Asian women. And so people in the community got to know me. And one thing you've got to realize is that the community was much stronger, much smaller at that time. So, I'd get calls saying, can you please go to the detention center? My cousin has being held up. Can you go and write about her case? So I used to do that. And in fact, in those early days, I was the first journalist to expose the detention center, which the first detention center at Heathrow Airport. And I remember there were two stories I wrote about which I can never forget. One was the story of a woman who was coming to this country. She was pregnant, and she was very heavily pregnant. And they put her through a lot of trauma, asking her a lot of questions, claiming that she wasn't the wife of the person she was coming, who had come to meet her, in fact. And so in the end, she said she went into labor, and they wouldn't actually believe that she was giving birth. So of course, the baby was born and it died, and very few questions were asked. I was the only journalist who wrote about it at the time, and it only warranted a few lines not on the front page. So these were the sort of horror stories of racism which we all faced. I mean, this particular woman, her name was Zahira Galiara. She was from Gujarat in India. The other story was of the virginity test, which I know Parminder certainly knows about. We were involved in protesting, but I remember how I went there and I met the women. I met one particular young woman who was actually in her bridal clothes. You know, she'd come to meet her husband. It was so heartbreaking to see her. She was so young. She was really, it was just awful, the whole situation. And you can imagine the kind of humiliation and kind of racism which lay under these sort of actions. And of course, they were called virginity tests at the time, and they're still referred to as such. But in today's world, we call them sexual abuse. What is sad is that the government has built many more detention centers now. And in those detention centers are not run by the government, they're run by private companies where the women face abuse with no questions asked. There's no accountability. So that's the country we live in now. So while we can say that, this country gave shelter to the East African nations, we must know that we live in very hard times today. We all are aware of it, and we should speak about it. So when I did these stories, I would always seek out to speak to women, because for me, women were the best narrators. They told you all kinds of details which made you understand what it felt like. And so soon I found that I had a big notebook full of interviews about this, that, and the other, about women in different situations, from different parts of the subcontinent as well as from East Africa. And so when I was asked if I wanted to write a book about South Asian women, at first I was very reluctant because I thought it would be extremely difficult. But then it was also a time when there were a lot of books being written about us as Asian women by white academics who saw us as objects of study in a way which reminded me of the anthropologists in the colonial era, for whom we were interesting natives, right? And so I was so worried that there would be a book about Asian women written by one of these people, that I thought maybe it's my duty to actually write something myself. So I got the contract, and every day I would think, well, today I'm going to start writing this book. But unlike Bharti, it was a huge struggle, because although I was quite used to writing, I just didn't know how to approach this massive task. And one day I had gone to East London, and I managed to lose my way. And I saw a woman, a Punjabi woman. She was going somewhere. So I asked her, can you tell me where the tube station is? So she said, you're a bit far from the tube station, and I'm not quite sure how to get there, but at home, I have a map. So if you come to my house, it's just here. I'll show you the way. So I went to her house, and she said, why don't you sit down and have a cup of tea? So I did. And then she produced a bit of food. I remember there was some mooli chutney. It was so hot, really hot, really nice. And we started talking, and she started telling me her story. And it was a very, very hard life she had. She was lonely, very lonely. And she worked extremely hard, very long hours. And at one point, she started telling me, I can talk to you because you want to listen. And also because I don't know you very well, but somehow I feel I can speak to you. And, she was crying, and my eyes were watering, and I don't know if it was the hot mooli chutney or just her story. So there are lots and lots of stories like this. And there were also the stories of women who had come from East Africa. And those were full of contradictions. And I'm glad that Bharti raised some of them. They, for example, would talk about how they had African servants and how, here you don't get that, right? They would talk about the racism that they felt towards Africans was so apparent. So on the one hand, there was that. On the other hand, there was their own suffering and their own strength, because they were exploited workers. Even people who were involved in the Grunwick strike, many of them were from East Africa. And they had the same approach to life, So, there were all of these issues jostling each other. And then there was also the issue of partition. Again, a massive trauma, which was never spoken about. And it's only recently, that work is being done to talk about that trauma, which has become intergenerational. Because, when there's a sadness, when there's a pain in the family, that pain can spread, through the generations. Of course, now we talk, I'm glad that Bharti talked about resilience, which is the theme of this. Now, resilience, is an interesting word because in many ways, it's a very personal word. It's about an individual who is not crushed, right? Who can stand up despite hardships. But, as we've settled in this country, as a new generation has grown up, they don't talk now about resilience. They talk about resistance. And the difference is that resilience is something individual. Resistance is something collective. And so we have all the different cases of people fighting back. School children who tried to protect their fellow school children from racial attack in places like Newham, and then were charged by the police, and then the community organized to fight those cases. There was a case of the Bradford 12, where they thought that the National Front were going to come and attack the community, and they organized to resist that. And as a result, were charged with really heavy sentences. And then they fought that case, and they won. And it was established that self-defense is no offense. So, we have a long history of struggle in this country, one way or another, a long history of resistance. But now we see something new. We see our communities themselves changing. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that change. If you go to Southall, if you go to places like Birmingham, I don't know about places like Cardiff, possibly it's the same, you find a lot of Indians, many of them speaking Hindi. They've come in very recent times. They're recent immigrants. Many have come by unofficial ways, right, let's say. They're fleeing India because India is supposedly such a rich country. It's full of billionaires, but the poverty and the unemployment are massive. And so you have people trying to go to America. Now, if you look, I was just looking at the recent figures, there are more Indians trying to cross the border to America than there are Mexicans. There are Indians who've been drowned in rivers trying to cross. So it's interesting how global politics, global changes affect us in this country. And with that, we have also new patriarchies. If you think about it now, in the old days, our mothers were housewives and they had their jobs. They somehow made two ends meet in this country. But now, today, the young women who are growing up, they have to have jobs in order to pay for their dowries. They have to look beautiful, look smart, have their jobs, do well, and then come home and cook for their mothers-in-law. I know people like that. And this is very, very hard. And as a result, if you look at the suicide figures among Asian women, it's the highest of most categories, certainly of women. So, there are lots of things which we need to be resilient about, and lots of things which we still need to resist. I think, something which I would need to mention, since Parminder is here, is that our idea of resilience, even back at that time, was one of collective resistance. And that's why soon after Finding a Voice was published, a number of us got together and we set up an organization called Awaz. Awaz was the first South Asian women's organization in this country. And we used to meet regularly. We used to identify things we wanted to do, and then we actually did them. I remember there was our protest against the virginity test, which was very, very effective, and which certainly had a part to play in stopping the virginity test at that time. We were also involved in a massive demonstration against, which we called Black people against police brutality. We used to call ourselves Black at that time because we worked with Africans and African Caribbeans. There was a degree of unity, despite the kind of prejudices which had been imported from East Africa. So, and then we had so many other things that we did in a short period. We supported strikes. We also set up the first Asian Women's Refuge for women fleeing domestic violence. So yes, I think there's memory, there's trauma, there's resilience, and then there's resistance. And we need a good dose of that resistance now, particularly with our wonderful Rishi Sunak in charge. Because you just have to look at the way refugees are treated today. When we think about how the East African nations were treated, I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't say they were treated very well, because from what I've seen, East African nations, even those with British passports, were not allowed easily into this country. Many, many of them were made stateless. Many were expelled to India, a country they had never lived in. And some were lucky enough to come here. And even then, as we heard, they faced a huge dose of racism. So what's happening to refugees now? They're being treated as though they're vermin, they shouldn't be here. They're criminals. And that's what we as Asians who've been through this, we as those who resist, we as those who have memories, we must get together to fight that kind of inhumanity which we see around us. I want to end on a happy note, but times are hard. And now I think the happiness which one feels is only when you feel that you have resisted, when you feel that your life is worth something. And for me, of course, I've lived a long, long time. And when I think of what makes me happy, I think it's always the times when I was able to resist with others, collectively, together. So thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Amrit. And I think it wasn't in the past tense. I think your life is all about resistance on an ongoing basis. And for that, we honor you really profoundly. I think you've really raised so many issues in the short time and made a really good demarcation between resilience and resistance, because the first generation who came, basically their idea of resilience was keep our heads down and let's get on with it. When the younger generation came up, they said, no, we've got to resist. And I think within that short period that you've spoken, you've really raked up a lot of the past, but also given us the connection that the past is, we are revisiting that on a daily basis, globally and locally. So thank you very much for that. And I'm sure I can see there's a number of comments and questions. So yeah, David?
First comment is from Marion, who says another fascinating presentation. Talks have emphasised the need for this project. We all need to know these stories. And then we've got a comment from Ray Singh, who says, excellent presentation and recollection of the journey and experiences of a very traumatized family. It draws many similarities of Fijian Indians expelled at the hands of Rabuka. And then we've got a question from another question, which I think is probably both for both speakers. And it says, you spoke about trauma and mental health issues as the result of your experience. Have you experienced generational trauma as a result? I know, Amrit, you did actually mention that in your talk, didn't you? I don't know if either of you got any comments about
Sorry,
that.
what was that question about trauma?
Have you experienced generational trauma?
Have you experienced?
Yeah, which I think you spoke about, didn't you? So, yeah. And that's it. Actually, that's the last of the questions. Nobody wants to put in, they can, but otherwise we finished with the questions. So thank you very much.
Can I just say about the generational trauma?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the questions was about, did we experience generational trauma? I think we did. I think it has gone down. I remember my mother, when she was alive, she was never able to relax. She used to say the passport has to be here. Every time there was a general election, she would get frightened. She would say, what if at that time, the National Front get in and they ask us to leave? She used to say, we need to send money to India, or so that if we have to leave, we're not destitute when we go there. And I think to a certain extent, that anxiety passed itself on to us. So when Amrit was talking about resistance, of course, we started to get involved with anti-racism and those sort of movements. And I think that is part of the generational trauma, because you are worried about the possibility of that ever happening. So you never really truly relax. However, when I look at my daughter, I would say she hasn't got that. She's very much, as Amrit says, about resistance. The thought that she might ever get deported or asked to leave a country just does not enter her mind. She would say, "Oh, you're paranoid. It's not going to happen." So she's much more relaxed. But when you've been through that displacement and when you've moved on, although you may show you're resilient in the way you live, and you might forge ahead and get new good careers, you may be working, that anxiety never really leaves. You always think, what if one day you can't take the freedom that you've got, the peace that you've got, your livelihood that you've got, you can't take it for granted once you've had that displacement. And so I think our parents never took it for granted after that. They were too frightened. My mum was particularly frightened every time there was a general election. She almost had a suitcase packed by the door in case we were asked to leave. Whereas, we went on to say, right, we're going to get involved in movements. However, that fear never really left either, and has never left. But with our own children, it's a completely different. They were born here. They don't have that sort of level of trauma or generational trauma that's been talked about. Can I just say also that, Amrit, you were the first author that I used in my A-level to talk about South Asian women's experiences. And I went on to get involved with domestic violence work as a result of your book. So I got involved with Asian Sahara, an Asian women's organization, the first ever refuge for Asian women, South Asian women. And it was a result of your book. It ignited that passion inside me. So it's such a privilege and an honor for me to meet you today. And I am so thrilled to be sharing this platform with you. I'm really happy.
Well, thank you so much, Bharti. That's so inspiring. Actually, something I meant to mention in my talk, because it's quite funny, was that after my book came out, I had some very mixed responses, I had like a lot of white social workers and so on, where they were not happy at all about the book. And they were saying, oh, she doesn't know anything about our Mrs. Patel, that kind of patronizing attitude. And then there were also a lot of older South Asian men who were not happy. I remember once a doctor visited us because my daughter wasn't well. And those days, doctors would visit you. Now, of course, they don't. But anyway, so he saw the manuscript lying on the table. He said, "What's this?" So I said, "That's a book I'm writing." So he said, "What's it about?" So I said, "It's about Asian women." He says, but who would be interested in Asian women? It's of no interest. So, there was all of that. But what was really positive was that I got like loads of letters, handwritten letters from Asian women saying how much the book meant to them. That is amazing, really. The days before email and WhatsApp. So,
Thank you.
And it was really their book. It wasn't my book, But to go back to trauma, yes, I completely agree with Bharti. I think the new generation born here, they don't have trauma. They have a lot of anxieties, though, I mean, a lot of young people I know suffer from anxiety because life is so fast, opportunities are so few, but it's different. It's not the same. But, the silence of women with trauma is, I think, the worst. That's what's, really painful because, you know, they have kept it inside. And that, you know, I think that you see in the partition memories as well, you know. So sad, really.
I think with the younger generation, they have their own struggles, their own racism to face. And I think, you know, they are being resistant, but not in the same way that perhaps the older generation or our generation was. I mean, constantly there are campaigns, there are issues. I mean, we've seen how Black children have been strip searched, you know, recently in London, so many of them by the police in a so-called safe setting like schools. So I think, you know, it goes on, but it goes on in for different generations in a different way.
And I think, you know, it's really important to acknowledge that racism hasn't gone away, you know. It's there in a very intense form. And also it has been reconfigured, you know, because now in addition to anti-Black racism, we have Islamophobia in a massive, you know, massive way. I mean, what are Muslims facing in this country? It's horrific, you know. And look at the way, you know, if you go on a demonstration for Palestine, you know, you can't even hold a placard, you know, which is completely harmless. I mean, it's like, you know, and so there's something with, you know, somebody had a very interesting placard of, I think it was Rishi Sunak, and there was a coconut tree with a coconut on it. And you know, the police said that this is not allowed. This is actually wrong. You will be arrested. And that woman was arrested. You won't believe it. Literally, you know, we live in a crazy country, you know.
Indeed.
Yeah. And I think in this short time we are together today, you've really highlighted all the contradictions, all the prejudices, all the oppressions, and none of us are exempt from it, really.
Well, I mean, it's
I think
really
there's a
great to
couple
have this, and I think, you know, Bharti's book is you know, it should be used just to discuss all of these issues because there's so much in it. You know, it needs to be sort of looked at, you know, so carefully to look at the detail of it. You know, because I have never come across a book like this before.
David, I think there's a question about what to do with young people and trauma.
Yeah. It says, thank you for addressing the generational trauma question. As a mother, I'd like to know what steps one can take to stop forwarding trauma to your children.
Sorry, what was it? What steps?
What steps can one take to stop forwarding trauma to your children?
Oh.
And Deepa speaks as a mother herself.
I mean, I think, you know, from what I have seen in terms of trauma in different situations, is that trauma needs to be spoken about, you know. It needs to come out. It needs to be normalized, as it were, you know, so that you know that what happened was not something to fear. It's not something to dread, you know. And I think once that happens, then the person who's traumatized feels better, and it also doesn't get transmitted, you know. It's, you know, we have a fear of fear in a way. We have a fear of depression. But the way to deal with that is to seize it, you know, to seize it and say, yes, I do, you know, I do have this fear because of this, this, and this, you know. I am depressed for these reasons, you know. And I think that's so important. And we as women are not taught to do that. We are taught to be silent.
I so agree with you, Amrit. I think that is the key, is to talk. The key is to explain to your children. The key is to not be stoical and think, I'm not going to share this, because that doesn't help you or your children. They will see the effects of the trauma, but they won't understand why you're behaving or saying things in a certain way. So it's really important to be open and honest. If your child is of an age and understanding that can take it. And, I think the other important thing, Amrita, is to seek therapy. If it's really affecting your life in a way that debilitates you from progressing emotionally or in any other way, then I think it's important also for your children to see that you are strong enough to go and seek therapy or counseling to help you with that trauma. Because sometimes the children that are born here, I find that they see it as a mental issue and they're like, oh, I'm not doing that, I'm not doing therapy. But if they see that parents are open to it and are open to seeking professional help if they need it, then it's less of a stigma for the younger generation as well, for the children.
I just wanted to share one thing, which is that obviously we are, collecting stories of Ugandan heritage people, and a number of women that we've spoken to as part of this project have said, we are too traumatized, but we want to tell our stories. So we are looking at how we can bring women together in a safe space where they decide exactly how they want to tell their stories, in what format, what shape, to help with their kind of closure and healing, but also to inform oral archives around dealing with trauma more effectively. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah.
David, I think we got some more comments.
Yeah, a couple more comments. One from Ravi, who says, thank you, Bharti and Amrit. You speak for us, those who still cannot find the words 50 years on. And then a comment from Farah as well. A privilege and honor to be here listening to such powerful women. And I want to share that as a Ugandan Asian refugee who is now a middle-aged woman having grown up in Wales, I have been blissfully fully unaware of your work, which speaks for the absence of resistance in Wales for fear and systematic racism. I thank you deeply for speaking to my very real lived experience.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, that's the end of the questions and the comments.
So any last words from you, Amrit, and then from Bharti before we close the session for this evening?
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank you again. I mean, I think it's been really interesting, and I think it's very encouraging to see that you're planning to do a lot more work coming out of this. I think the issue of trauma is very central here, and it really needs to be looked at. And also, I think while looking at trauma is probably a good time to also look at the divisions created by outside forces in the community, which are massive, as we know. But it will give you a chance to examine them, because those also create fear, fear, hatred, pain of different kinds. And I think the trauma session should include that. It's also worth, something I feel also is really important, particularly for younger people, is to know our history, because history is constantly erased in our present world, People don't know. And, you have young people saying, okay, we're going to organize this, that, and the other. And many of them are reinventing the wheel. It's great that they're doing it, but they are reinventing the wheel, because we've done that, and it would be helpful if they could maybe learn from that, or at least be aware of that, and that's our history in this country, let alone there's also our history back home, Our history didn't start with the Modi Sarkar, It's much older. So we need to actually delve into that and talk about it. Maybe you should have some sessions doing that.
Thank you. Bharti, from you?
So I just wanted to, I think a lot has been said, and it's been a very insightful and a very productive evening. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I just want to say it's been a deep, deep honor to come here today and to talk to people and talk about my book, and to meet you, Parminder, and to meet Amrit and David as well. Thank you so much, everybody, for inviting me. And you know, I am on Instagram, so if people want to follow me or ask me questions, please go ahead and do that. But thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Bharti.
Everybody.
Yeah, there's a whole team. There's a whole team behind us.
Yes, of course.
There's Radha, Robin, Jyoti, Nicola, and all the colleagues in the commission. So we all very, very glad to have you both for this talk today. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Amrit, you wanted to say something?
I just want to say thank you to everyone who made this possible, because
yes,
you know, after the initial problems, it's gone really smoothly, and
yes,
and also we've been able to have this really informal and in-depth conversation, which has been so good.
It has, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I ask David to wrap up for the evening, I just want to give you a date for your diary for our next seminar, which is the 18th of April, which is on the Grimetius project in Wales, which tells the story of 1.6 million Indian laborers who were sent to different colonial countries to fulfill the shortage of labor left by the abolition of slavery. You've actually heard from Ray Singh. He made a comment or asked a question, and Ray will be one of the speakers of the Grimetius descendants on the 18th of April. So a date for your diary. It's a forgotten, not very much talked about story, and something that we really want to bring to the fore in terms of you know, making people aware that this project is going on in Wales. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Parminder. And yn gloi, hoffwn diolch yn fawr I chi am ymuno â ni heno I staff y Comisiwn am Drefnu, ac yn olaf diolch yn fawr iawn I chi, Bharti a Amrit, am eich straeon pwerus a diddorol iawn. Thank you very much to you all for joining us tonight. And thanks also to the Commission staff who have been involved in the arrangements. And of course to Bharti and Amrit for your very powerful and fascinating stories. We hope to see you at our next talk. Nos da.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nos da, everyone.